On the 26th of February 2019, an awarded controversial documentary, In the Name of Confucius, had its premiere in the Danish Parliament. 3 politicians from different parties were on the panelist of the debate relating to the freedom of the Academy after the premiere. Money, power, politics, loss of academic integrity, violations of human rights, foreign influence, and even potential infringements on national security are mixed with the education of our youth in the Western world. In the Name of Confucius is the first documentary to expose China's multi-billion-dollar Confucius Institute, a Chinese language program that has found its way into over 1,500 universities and schools worldwide. Our Future House and Tibet Support Committee in Denmark have organised a premiere in the Danish Parliament. An awarded journalist gave a presentation of his survey to the Confucius Institutes in Denmark, alerting awareness.
As we can see from the documentary, there are certainly some controversies to dig into on this matter. So Thomas, you can just use that one.
Thank you for having me here this afternoon. My name is Thomas Vogt and I work as an investigative reporter at the Confucius Institute. Last fall, I did a project that I called Kina i kulissen, which is China behind the curtain. I did a number of stories and reports about Chinese influence, Chinese activity in Denmark. As part of that project, I was looking into Confucius, as we've just seen. And my inspiration actually also came from Canada, because I've seen a lot of these discussions abroad, these controversial stories that has been told in Canada and US, Australia. There's also been some episodes in Europe. I found out quickly that Aalborg University has had an institute for 10 years now, and that got my interest, and I wanted to see if I could find any controversial episodes or any kind of censorship or any political influence in Aalborg University and that program that they have. Found out that Aalborg, over the last 10 years, they received over 10 million kroner in fundings from China and from the Chinese education ministry, Hanban, as we saw in the documentary. I also sort of described what kind of program that the Confucius Institute is, and I sort of listed up some of the controversial episodes we've seen over the last few years. I started to research on this by doing a Freedom of Information Act, which is Aktindsigt, offentlighedsloven in Danish, and I got these numbers which showed what kind of fundings Aalborg University is getting from China over the years. There were some annual fundings, there were also some fundings to specific projects, to specific classrooms. What I found most interesting in my research was actually that I was talking to sources who knew more about these institutes, and they were saying that a lot of the big universities in Denmark actually rejected these Confucius Institutes over the years. And I found out that it was actually the biggest universities in Denmark who were not interested in hosting these programs. Copenhagen University, Roskilde, Danish Institute for International Studies, also called DIS, the university in Odense, universities in Aarhus, they all rejected to host Confucius because of the academic freedom, because of the independence, and because they feared a kind of political influence. I started to investigate a little bit more about these certain reasons to reject Confucius. Again, I filed a request for information at DIS. I found out that in the summer of 2017, they were actually offered to have Confucius Institute. What was interesting is that in the documents I could suddenly see that they also were very much aware about the controversial episodes and influence that we've seen over the world. This is some sort of a conclusion that they made internally at DIS, and they were saying that there's a risk by receiving this money from China. It can create some limitations for us if we want to approach some some angles on China, especially on subjects that could be sensitive. So it was obvious that they were nervous to host a program like this. And I think, especially in Denmark, in the universities, they care a lot about academic independence. I could also see that there was a board meeting at DIS where this issue was discussed. The director, Christian Fischer, wrote that they received a lot of requests that they should really be aware about what Confucius Institute is, and that again it could be a difficult situation for these to receive this money if they still wanted to be respected in this environment. And they also said that their independence could be harmed in this matter. I found this was quite interesting. Furthermore, I was in touch with the principal of Odense University, STU. He actually told me that back in, I think it was 2011, they were also offered to have a Confucius program. And they actually started to have some negotiations with these Chinese partners. And it became more and more clear to the management at Odense University that they wanted a lot of influence from China in this particular program. It was actually the reason why Syddansk University, they pulled out. The principal actually said this in our radio back in December. He said there was a strong influence that if we wanted to be a Confucius Institute, we had to pull it in some certain directions. And he also elaborated on that and told us that there were specific requirements on what kind of literature they should use in the classrooms, what kind of curriculum they wanted to use. A lot of different requirements that made Odense University nervous about what kind of program this is, if it was a very strong influence from these institutes. I did a report that was explaining that Aalborg University received these millions over a few years, but on the same side, there was a lot of other universities who rejected and declined this kind of program because of their independence, because they were afraid of political interference or censorship in the classroom. Of course, we also reached out to Aalborg University because we were interested in knowing why do you go into this kind of program with all these controversies around the world. The dean of Aalborg University, he said to us that they've never been exposed to any of this. They were very much aware about all the problems that has been around the world. He told us that the situation with Aalborg is different because they consider the program like a very small one. It's some sort of a satellite. It's only a limited introduction to Chinese language, Chinese culture, and in that sense, he says that there's no risk. He says. However, I also found out, which is interesting, is that they have some Chinese guest teachers who are coming, who's a part of Hanban and came to Aalborg to teach. But these teachers, they don't teach some of the sensitive subjects. They do not teach in Tibet, Taiwan, or in human rights. These subjects are being taught by Danish researchers. So I think that was an interesting detail to it. We found out that these teachers, they do some small programs in public schools, which are kids mostly. We found out that there's some lessons which are about human rights, but we don't know what kind of material they use in these lectures, these classrooms. Because of course, based on all the controversies, I was interested in finding out what kind of narrative is it that the kids and students are presented to when it is a part of this Confucius Institute program. But I was never able to get access to these kind of material, even though it would be very interesting to see if they sort of suppress or exaggerate some certain subjects related to China. So I think that was some sort of the overall story and research I did. Yeah, so if you have any questions, about this, feel free to ask. I think we have a few minutes. Right?
So if there's one or two questions for Thomas, that can be allowed. Yeah.
I think I can shout loud enough. My name is Jens. Just quickly, have you done did you investigate into the Confucius Institute, CBS, Copenhagen Business School?
No, I have not. So the question is that if I looked into CBS a little bit more, I was not looking into CBS that much. Interestingly, is that actually CBS, they decided to close their institute. I think it's in 2017.
Okay.
And when they closed, they actually offered D's to take over.
Yeah.
So that's why D's, they were in 2007 considering if they should take over. And I still haven't found out why it was so important for CBS to pass it on to someone else. And I don't know actually the reason for CBS to stop their program.
Only a question, how many places in Denmark are there those Confucius Institutes or classrooms, etc.? You understand Aalborg, where I know the Copenhagen Music School, but how many institutes, how many students are exposed to that influence, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So, and is it discussed in the public? First time I really hear a discussion like this. It must have been discussed, but not in the public much.
It's true. I think this subject is not discussed a lot in the Danish public. I think it's not been covered a lot by the Danish media. That was also a part of it for me to make some research about it. I know that there are some classrooms in different institutions. I'm looking at Anders. Is it 8 classrooms? 8? 7? 7? Yeah, 7. But I think that also includes gymnasiums, right? Yeah. And I also know that there are some public schools in Aalborg who have classrooms, because some of the funding that Aalborg got from China was used to make classrooms. That's the number.
And there's also a Confucius Institute at the Royal Danish Academy of Music, which is an institute that has been working right now with the arrival of the pandas. They're producing the symphony that should greet the pandas when they arrive, together with Confucius Institute. So that's another side note.
As a Chinese Canadian, I was born and educated in China. I knew and I heard about Confucius Institutes, of course, and I knew Confucius Institutes teaches Chinese language and culture, but that's it. And not until early 2013, when I read an article from a major Canadian paper, which says McMaster University in Canada, like you saw in the film, was closing down its Confucius Institutes because of the discriminatory hiring policy against the Falun Gong practitioners. And that was the first time I heard about anything controversial about the Confucius Institutes, and that triggered my great interest. I was a TV reporter back then, covering China-Canada relation and Chinese-Canadian and that sort of things. And so, of course, as you can imagine, I was also worked in a Chinese university as well. Education is very important to me, and the whole value of the Western democracy is very important to me. So I myself wanted to find out what Confucius Institutes was all about. Is it just a very friendly gesture posed by the Chinese government, which helped the foreigners to learn Chinese language and culture, or is there any hidden so-called sinister or that so friendly agenda behind that gesture? So I wanted to find out myself and share my findings with others. So I decided to make a documentary, and lucky enough I got some funding from Canadian government. So I took 3 years to make this film, and then in the last 2 years I was traveling around the world sharing my findings with audiences across the world.
And now that you've heard Thomas speaking a little about the Danish case, I don't know if you've been to Sweden as well, because we've heard this again and again, both in documentary and in some of the comments that you just had, that some of the directors say, oh well, but our case is different. Our institute is different. It's not the same thing. But do you have some reflections or some comments on that? Do you see a general pattern for the institutes, or can there be more specific differences?
Right. That I would say that is the common reaction for anyone who is supportive to the Confucius Institutes would reject to the discussion about the controversies surrounding the Confucius Institutes, as you saw in my film, as you heard from Thomas, right? The Danish Confucius Institutes would. That's very common. They would think the problems are other institutions, that institutions is not mine. That could be true. That could be true. There are perhaps some individual universities or school boards, they haven't experienced any censorship or self-censorship of that propaganda. That could be the case, but I think we want to look at the overall pattern, as you mentioned, as well as the true intention of the Chinese government in order to initiate this effort. That is what matters, right? So the pattern I found out before the Confucius Institutes was opened physically, usually the negotiation was done very quietly. That means not many people in that Western university or school board know about this discussion. Like the case of University of Chicago, very prestigious one in the United States. The faculty members didn't know anything about the university administration's attention about inviting the Confucius Institutes on campus. So many years ago, when the faculty knew the Confucius Institutes was going to open in a shortly time, many faculty petitioned. They wrote letters against the university administration's decision, but that failed. They couldn't succeed in prevent this from happening. But 10 years later, in 2014, just as you saw the public protest happening in Toronto, at the same time, University of Chicago faculty, 107 of them, again wrote petition letter against the university from renewing the Confucius Institutes. And that protest succeeded, so Confucius Institutes was not existing any longer in University of Chicago. So that's just one particular case to show you. And I found it's a very common pattern in terms of how the Confucius Institutes was opened. Quiet discussion, and until the last moment, teachers or faculties in that educational institution knew about it. There was no time for them to protest its own administration. And then while the Confucius Institutes is operating on the foreign campus, there is no shortage of examples of one, propaganda materials coming in on foreign campuses through Confucius Institutes. That's not one individual cases in one country. That's a very common phenomenon. I could go details on and on, but I know we have limited time. So that's one. And two, there's no lack of evidences of how the Confucius Institutes censor certain topics, as Thomas just introduced to you, share with you. There's no talk of Tibet independence, no talk of Taiwan independence, no talk about human rights abuses in China. Nowadays, they don't even talk about economic problems China is facing or the environmental problems China is facing. So that means the taboos and sensitive topics are growing. There are more and more topics not discussed in the Confucius Institutes. If you are going to discuss those topics deemed sensitive or taboos by the Chinese government, you better speak in the same way that the Chinese government discuss it. For example, the Maryland University in the United States, which is the very first American university to open the Confucius Institutes, they held a picture exhibition about Tibet. The pictures were all taken by Xinhua News Agency, which we all knew is the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. So those pictures show you beautiful landscape of Tibet and happy faces of the Tibetan people. But on the other side, we know there are at least 100 Tibetan people set themselves on fire just as an extreme means to protest the Chinese government's very hard-handed how to deal with the minority issues. So which one is the fact? Which one is the real story you want to believe? So that's how they discuss those issues. And there's also self-censorship, which means the host universities, they even without the Chinese government's request, they already do not discuss those sensitive issues already. There are a lot of examples. In Australia, Sydney University once wanted to hold a speech. They invited Dalai Lama, the Holy Dalai Lama, on campus to give a speech, but eventually the speech was moved off campus, and also the university doesn't allow the organizer to use any logo of the university, and they didn't allow the pro-Tibet people to attend that speech. So that's self-censorship. So
from what you're saying, there are some general patterns about the materials being used, that are the same materials that are being sent out. And as we saw from the film, some of these materials include songs praising General Mao and other. Yeah. And at the same time, there are this negligence towards talking about sensitive issues.
Neglect. They don't encourage that.
Exactly. So, to go to the politician side of the table, now I know that you, Mikael, did not see most of the movie, unfortunately, because you were caught up in voting.
I didn't caught up in foreign policy voting.
That's interesting. Okay, you are excused. Just to brief you up, in the movie, we see the director of Hanban, which is the organization that provides the teachers under the Chinese government ministry, talking about how Confucius Institutes is a form of soft power, and how this is one of the most important forms of soft power that the Chinese government can employ to the world. So my question to you, and it's to all three of you actually, is should we regard these Confucius Institutes and the materials and the negligence to talk about these sensitive topics as a form of soft power where the Chinese government is trying to infiltrate some of the systems around Western countries, in Denmark as well?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this debate. I really believe it's a very, very important topic to discuss. So I am very afraid and sorry that I was able to watch the movie, but I hope I get a chance afterwards in some capacity. Regarding the People's Republic of China, yeah, that is soft power. And the People's Republic of China is actually also using the soft power in many ways. We have seen, for example, in Copenhagen, for not that many years ago, they established their so-called cultural center, which in my view is a propaganda institute here in Copenhagen. We've also seen in other areas. They have the so-called panda diplomacy. And we're also getting pandas. And the problem with all of this is that I think every politician in Denmark believes that the government of China is neglecting and actually also cracking down on every attempt of human rights, democracy, freedom of speech, and every other basic democratic ideas that there is in the world in China. I think everybody agrees about that. But the problem is, of course, their economic size. Because China has now grown to a size that is very, very difficult to manage. Especially when they are probably going to, take over the #1 position as the greatest economic power in the world, which I think will take place perhaps in 10, 15 years. So when they have this very enormous economic power, it is quite impossible to be a small country with 5.6 million people and saying, well, China, listen to us and you should do this and this and this. Because what happens then? Well, we've seen attempts about that. We have also seen attempts about that in Denmark. And I don't, need to tell you about that because you know about that. Where they, well, on first level, they put us, in the freezer. Where every attempt about any progress regarding trade issues, regarding diplomacy issues and so on, are completely disregarded. But there are other steps as well, which are more and more strict, because they have the power to do so. So if we in the international community, especially in the democratic international community, doesn't come together and try to be one voice against China, we will never win. Never. So that's why I actually always, say we have to find common ground, for example, in EU or elsewhere, where we can be perhaps a bit more, where we stand together in that regard. So I think I'll answer your question with a very long answer, sorry about that, in stating, yeah, there is soft power and they're using it. We could be better in perhaps being stronger against that soft power, but it is quite difficult, and that's why I actually would like to do that, perhaps in a EU, perhaps in a Nordic or some other organization perspective.
But before I go to you, Kenneth, I just have a very brief follow-up, because you say, Mikael, that we should find common ground, and it's difficult to stand up against China unless you have common ground. But at the same time, you also say that it's impossible for a small nation like Denmark to do anything. And on that note, it's just interesting, I think, that you at the same time come from a government party that has just accepted the pandas, which is a quite political hot topic, because we've seen both in history and all around the world, the pandas are only given to those who are very nice in the eyes of the Chinese people.
Yes. Well, first of all, a lot of more and more European countries are actually accepting now the pandas. So we're not the only one. Let's say it like that. And the so-called gift is actually quite expensive gift, because we have to build a huge new facility for them, which is quite expensive. But being a member of the Foreign Policy Committee, not the Foreign Affairs Committee, but the Foreign Policy Committee, which is the closed door committee, which was the one I just participated in, we actually get a chance to see what the ministers at any given time meet a counterpart in other countries say. And I can't tell you about what they're saying. I can just tell you that because that's classified. But I can tell you, any given time, a Danish minister meets a Chinese counterpart. They bring up some kind of areas where they say, you have shortcomings regarding this and this and this. What is your answer to that? I can tell you that. And that is of course important, because that is also a reply to the soft power. And I think that is what we try to do. So I can promise you, this is not this government's position that we should just say, oh, everything is peachy in PRC, because it's not. And we will still get the chance to say so.
Kenneth?
Thank you. You can phrase things in many different ways. First of all, I would like to say that I think there's a lot of naivety in this debate. When researching to this meeting, I fell over an article from the Danish local newspaper Sjællandske, which has to do with the Næstved. This gymnasium says that it says a lot of things in this article, but among the things we say that is that these censor-free teachers who are coming from China, they are coming here as part of their Chinese education as a teacher, and they're not very happy about talking about the Cultural Revolution and marriage along, but we avoid it, so there's no problem. Yes, so there's no censorship, we just avoid talking about difficult issues. What I actually fear the most about this is actually not, even though I fully acknowledge what you have been doing, Thomas, but it's actually not primarily the Copenhagen Business School or Aalborg University, because I have a sense that people must in some way be have some idea of what is going on in China. What I really think is problematic is something like this. Because if you take high school students in Denmark or children in public schools and introduce them to Chinese teachers who come to Denmark, who do not want to talk about the Cultural Revolution or Tibet or Taiwan or pollution or whatever, and let these people talk to high school teachers or children in public schools, then you have a great chance of actually directing them in a certain way to talk about, to think about China in a way that is the way that the Chinese government wants. So I actually think that this is far worse than the musical academy, even though that's terrible too, but this is more dangerous. This is more dangerous because you're taking pupils who do not have much idea of what is going on in China and introducing them to a very abstract way, a very wrong way, in my opinion, to look on China. And I think that this is something that we as politicians has to do something about quite soon. I can see that, for instance, this Støvring Gymnasium in the northern part of Jutland and Stenhus Gymnasium in Holbæk, and I think Niels Stensens too, probably also other gymnasium has this program, and I think it needs to be stopped. And I would like for the Minister of Education to do something about this, because we are dealing with a full-torn dictatorship, which is introducing its own thoughts into the minds of young Danish pupils. And we have to stop that. We have to stop that.
Said in the documentary, there was this point about which I really felt was that the Chinese government think in generations, not in terms of a few years. And on that note, Christian, do you think that we should, as Kenneth suggests, do something that prevents these kind of programs from entering into secondary and high schools and gymnasiums here in Denmark politically?
I think it's not so easy that we hear from Kenneth. I think we always are attacked of soft power. All my life I've been heard from some, don't be friendly to Russians. The Russians are coming, they are imperialists. And from other people said, don't interfere that much with the US because they are imperialists and they have only one sign of ideas, and you have to follow the foreign policy of US if you want to be friends of them. All these sayings, all these trying to get influence when you are a big country. Also companies, we don't discuss companies, we only discuss countries here. The companies are even bigger and more influential than the countries often. So we have to say not only, oh, this school don't have to make cooperation with some Chinese people. We have to develop our country, our democracy, our critical thinking, our intellectual critical work at the universities, so that they can go up against these things. Because when we go to a political decision that says the school has to do this and this and must not do this and this, then we walk at the same way as the Chinese, but on our way. I don't like this, because a real democracy will be strong enough to go against every soft power if they develop their country with democracy, with critical thinkings and all this. And we cannot just turn back and say, well, every time we find some people we don't like out of our country, every time we find ideas debated some places out, then we do the same, and we make a false way of developing our country. I hope that all young people that go to universities, they'll be critical, democratic people who analyze everything and say, oh, I can look behind these campaigns. And I will say to everyone who wants to influence in Denmark, please only use soft power. Because in these years there's building up military in a way I've never seen before in my life. And I feel more that than discussions, more that than ideas confrontate each other. And I'll say, that's why I sometimes say to different governments, why the hell do you say yes to these pandas? What is behind this? These questions you have to ask. I asked the Prime Minister, I asked the Foreign Minister, I got no answer. I said, what have you discussed? What kind of foreign policy question did you ask? What kind of human rights question did you ask? Why the hell did you put the police against Danish demonstrators when we have visits from China? That's at least important questions to rise to our own politicians. I don't think they are blind. I hope they are critical when they go there. But I have seen in other countries, also very strong countries, they forget to ask the questions. Think about all these politicians. Even in our parliament, we have had a lot of politicians that have got their high school and university education in US. And they are really defending the US way of looking at the world. I would prefer that they were more critical, also in this way. But our foreign policy, when we discuss this, in these years we have a foreign minister who says directly, we are following US in Venezuela, in all the wars around, and if they ask, we are ready to go. I mean, that's uncritical. Why don't they ask the questions before? I could mention at least 5 wars I mentioned. Why didn't the governments never put the critical questions? I asked once to get the papers that was behind the Libyan war. I'm not good at English. I said, please get it in Danish so I can analyze what is behind this. It's not impossible. It's not possible. The socialist foreign minister, Willy Søvndal, said. He said, you have to learn English or you cannot sit here in parliament. I mean, what is that? We have, and we got 48 hours to decide if Denmark went into a war. So we also have to say something to ourselves and the way we are practicing soft power and other things, or denying critical debates.
Yeah. Kenneth, and then Mikael afterwards, and make it a bit short because we need time for questions as well.
Of course, I'll try to make it short. Well, what if we were to teach the religion of Islam in our high schools by using teachers from Saudi Arabia? How would that turn out? Would that be beneficial to our students? I don't think so. And I really don't see much difference to whether we introduce teacher pupils in Danish schools to China by using Chinese teachers, or we're introducing Islam to Danish pupils by using teachers from Saudi Arabia. That's why I'm saying that these the gymnasiums should actually be able to handle this for themselves. They should be able to say, no, we do not want to participate in this. But they don't. Actually, then we have to take the responsibility as politicians and say to them that this is a very bad idea, that you are acting in a very wrong way towards this. And I also think that it's very important here to say what kind of country we're dealing with. We're dealing with a country that is killing political prisoners, which are sending people to work camps, which do not have any respect whatsoever for freedom rights, which suppress their population, and which are trying to suppress us as civilians, as citizens in the Western world. We should not accept that in any way or manner, and I will always stand to that idea. And I also think that we should acknowledge the fact that it's going in the wrong direction in China. If it has ever gone in any better direction, then it certainly isn't today. When President Xi has rejected term limits, he can now be a new Mao, sitting there for ages and ages as president of a more and more powerful China. And I think that I, of course, acknowledge the fact that Michael is saying this is difficult because of the economic power of China. Yes, of course it's difficult. But I don't think it's difficult to say no to the Confucius Institute. I think actually that's quite simple. And I think that we should at least do the simple things. We should at least say no to this. We don't need to acknowledge and go into a trade war with China. But if the Chinese come and introduce the Confucius Institute at a gymnasium or a high school or a university or whatever, then just say no.
Yeah, Mikael?
Well, first of all, before we make the panelists to do like, I don't know, some kind of invasion from PRC, just let's stick to the facts. This government actually said no to the Chinese on things that matters. What is the PRC doing right now? They're trying to build up infrastructure and buying infrastructure around the world. And they have also attempted that in Denmark. They have tried to buy a former Danish military base in Greenland. We said no. They tried to invest in airports in Greenland. We have said no to that. And they are also now trying to perhaps, via Huawei, to build our 5G network in Denmark. And we said, we're not quite sure that's the best idea, and our intelligence agencies are looking into it right now. So the facts are quite telling clear signal that this government is actually quite worried about the growing, let's say, influence that China is actually having around the world. And we're trying to fight it. And we will still be trying to fight it. Then there is the concrete case about this institute coming to Næstved, I think it was. It's quite difficult for us as a politicians in a Danish parliament to say to a high school in Næstved, you're not allowed to do this and this and this, and you should hear them for us. They're quite independent about who they can invite and who they cannot invite. I'm actually a former mayor. Quite many years ago still, but still, I am a former mayor. And I actually think it's important that if you have local area of responsibilities and a high school have their own independent board, then it's that board that should actually make the decision about who they actually want to invite or not.
All right, before we open up for questions, we start with a question from Doris to the politicians.
Thank you for this chance. Sorry, because I'm Canadian, I'm not familiar with how the policies of government running in Denmark. So I just have a question for any of the politicians. You mentioned we just start from the simple things, say no to Confucius Institutes. But my question is, in Canada, government doesn't have any role in universities' decision-making in what kind of program they want to engage or not. So I'm not sure how you make the universities or school board in your country say no to Confucius Institute.
Some years ago, I wrote a book about school books in Denmark, which were very, in my opinion, leftist and very strongly derogatory towards the Danish People's Party, my party. Our spokesperson of Educational Affairs asked the Minister of Education, which was Bertel Haarder at the time, a lot of questions regarding these books and what were in them. And he luckily said his opinion about it. For instance, it said in one of the books that the Danish People's Party was a fascist party. It says it was a fascist party as such. And he said that he thought that that was totally unacceptable, and that it was up to the judges, to the court system, whether or not it was, a penal offense to write that. That made a change. I have not seen any Danish books, school books, saying that our party is a fascist party. So if you have a minister of Educational Affairs who is ready to say his opinion out loud, who is ready to say, take a strong stance regarding this, saying, yes, we have a problem with the Confucius Institute. Yes, we have a problem with interference from China. Of course, it's still up to you as a gymnasium to choose the one or the other. Then I'm sure the gymnasium will choose wisely. What we need are strong politicians that are able to send signals, clear and firm signals. And then, of course, it is up to the gymnasium to find out for itself. But as long as we just keep our mouths shut and say, okay, you've chosen that, it's fine by us, we cannot interfere, we cannot have any opinion, we have an arm's length principle and so on, nothing happens. Wise decisions will not be made, and we need wise decisions.
Okay, so perhaps you should arrange that the educational minister should watch this movie as a first step, perhaps. I have seen you, Christian, I have also seen you, but we need to open up the floor for questions, so maybe you can take your points if you ask the question. Questions? You, and then you. All right, and I have seen you, Vinny, as well.
Okay, my name is Charlotte, and I could have a lot of questions, but one of the issues about, we certainly don't want politicians to interfere with the education system in Denmark, because that has already been done too much with disastrous effects. But I think about the media, I think about writing books, get some kind of public, popular support towards, for instance, getting money from the Confucius Institute. I think that's a good way to go. I mean, I have been interested in Chinese affairs and Tibet for many years, but I never really heard about Confucius Institute, which shows me that it is something which is not really a concern of the Danish people, and maybe even the people who take decisions in universities and schools, etc., they don't really know a lot of the background. So rather than the politicians, I think public opinion and knowledge and information, I think that is the way to go. And I didn't know about your program either, and I think that's a good idea. A good thing that you did that program, but unfortunately I didn't hear it. And another comment, I think the Confucius schools or institute is only one concern. What I'm much more concerned about, that is the pressure that China, or that the Danish politicians and other cultural institutions, etc., has let China have a say in our freedom of speech and whatever we want to do, for instance, including not inviting the Dalai Lama and other things. I think that's one thing which is really worrisome. And the other one is the buying of Danish infrastructure. And I hope that at the next election, one of your clear goals will be to refuse, for instance, the selling of the influence of Chinese government on 5G and other networks, which we as people can.
What's the question?
Well, the question is, what is? Are you actually going to take a stand on these issues, which are really important for the Danish population, and we have no way to say no? One is the propaganda and the freedom of speech, which is being limited, and the other one is the selling out of important infrastructure like the 5G. It would be very interesting now that we have an election coming up.
And And just in terms of time, we'll take 2 questions at once. Is that okay? All right. It was you, and then it was you. Yeah. And keep it to a question.
I just want to say congratulations, and I understand fully why Denmark get the pandas. I have done some research before coming here, and I would like to ask the politicians here, did you know that there is a very, very good Chinese-Danish partnership with a university called Danish University? And they have all 8 universities together with a Chinese partnership. So I fully agree that you got the pandas. This is very serious. So my question is, as I have Muslim friends and who are from Uyghur or the north of China, would they be able to go to China and do some education from Denmark to China and do the religions or believe in Allah, or could a Tibetan go to China at this university, or could a Falun practitioner who practice in Denmark go to this university and go and have some partnership and go to China? This is my question. This is very serious. So, of course, we should talk about Confucius Institute, but we all know that China always go another way. So, this can be a very good discussion about the Confucius Institute, but you have all 8 universities together with China. Congratulations. And how do you stand up and talk with the education minister about these questions? Thank you.
It's true. Okay, so that was a lot at the same time. It was freedom of speech, it was minorities, and it was a level down here, and there was a level all the way up here. So, who wants to be the one to answer? Yeah, Kenneth? Yeah, I'll take you.
I can try. Try to give a short answer. Well, briefly said, I understand too why Denmark got those pandas, and I also like pandas. I've even seen them in Hong Kong, where I was a couple of years ago. They're very nice, but I'm not quite sure that I'm so happy that they're arriving in Denmark. Not because I don't want them, but what is behind them, I think, is problematic. Well, I think that it has been pretty clear that Denmark has wanted the more cooperation between Danish universities and Chinese universities. I remember reading several times both the Minister of, what's that called? Not education, but the level above that. As well as the former minister of Erhvervsminister Brian Mikkelsen, speaking about the need for Danish universities and Chinese universities to cooperate. And all at that time, and that was during the last non-socialist government, so that was during the period 2001 until 2011, I was very skeptical towards this. Because I think it is problematic to further a cooperation with universities which are in a country where there is no freedom of research, there is no freedom rights in any way. I think it's problematic to have that agenda. But I think it's also fair to say that there is a rather broad majority of the Danish parliament that supports the way that the current government has orchestrated its policy towards China. What I think is a milestone in Danish policy towards China is, of course, the declaration regarding the potential independence of Tibet, which were done during the former government, and which, in my opinion, was the final knee roll from the Danish government regarding China, and which was very problematic, which I do not understand that what was carried through, but it was. I think that it's very important for us constantly to focus on the fact that we are dealing with a dictatorship. And when you are dealing with a dictatorship, then you should be aware of that. You should not be discouraged from dealing with the dictatorship just because of ideas about its strong economy and so on, but you should remember it, and you should indeed remember it when it comes to dealing with, for instance, universities or education as such, because universities and education in China is much different from what is the fact in Denmark or other Western European countries where you have freedom of research. You do not have any kind of freedom of research in China, especially not on issues regarding to history, social sciences, and so on.
All right, the question from here.
Hello. I'm a Chinese researcher educated in a Danish system. Okay, I'm a Chinese researcher educated in a Danish system, so I felt I'm kind of exposed to two sets of different ideology here. And Confucius Institute also happened to be my research topic. And so I, as an anthropologist, I have to go to my field, which is Confucius Institute. I have to spend a month together with the teachers and students sitting in the classroom. And what I've seen is very, very different from this picture depicted here. Because, for example, a lot of the Chinese teachers there, they're girls in their 20s, and their students sitting in the classroom are sometimes businessmen in their 40s. So I really doubt these 20 years girls have strong influence upon these businessmen to propaganda certain to promote certain Chinese ideology to them. Also in the classrooms, in elementary schools, a lot of the Chinese teachers I have interviewed, they cried their way from the elementary schools back to Confucius Institute because they want their students to improve fast in learning a language, while in, for example, the UK, you couldn't really tell the students they're not doing good enough. So it's very difficult for the teacher to actually discipline the students to learn the Chinese hardly. So, I mean, what I've seen in the field is a struggle of the teacher as individual, and institutions struggle to actually establish themselves, to justify themselves. So this kind of very, very powerful, very evil image of Confucius Institute is to some extent different from what I see. And my question for the politicians here today is, do you think that by saying no to the Confucius Institute, you are also denying the opportunity to some Danish people who are interested in China, who actually like to get to know more about China, the chance of learning Chinese freely? And is it also possible that the Hanban, Chinese government, couldn't control each of the Confucius Institute and each of the Chinese teachers to such extent that they're just tools? Maybe they're just young people want to see the world and take this opportunity to as a high salary job to come abroad, to go abroad, because this is what they say to me when I interview them. Thank you.
Perhaps Doris, do you want to answer that one?
Yes. I think first, what you have experienced, this is one individual cases among all 548 Confucius Institutes plus over 1,000 Confucius classrooms. Yes, what you have experienced is exactly what the panda image, the fuzzy, friendly image and soft image of the Confucius Institutes. And I have no doubt of many of the Confucius Institute's instructors, just like you mentioned, in their early 20s, like Sonia in my film, who love teach Chinese language as a second language to foreigners. They want to make friends with foreigners. They want to experience a different way of life and society, which they don't get chance to experience in China. It's really good. I am pro-Chinese language and culture education and pro-cultural exchange for every means. But who is behind that Confucius Institutes? initiative. It is the dictatorship of Chinese Communist government. And I tell you, it's not that the Chinese government couldn't control each and every Confucius Institute or Confucius classroom. It is exactly the opposite way, which is the Chinese government controls everything happening inside a Confucius Institute or Confucius classroom. Let me tell you the organization chart of the Confucius Institutes. Confucius Institutes is overseen by Hanban, which is under Education Ministry of the People's Republic of China. Hanban is governed by a council. The chair of the council is the current vice premier of the People's Republic of China, is the top 25 Politburo member of the Chinese Communist Party. And she was also the former chair of the United Front Work Department, which is the spy agencies of the CCP as well as the propaganda organizations of the CCP. If you don't know what United Front Work Department is about, to put it simple, this department is responsible to make each and anyone who could be possibly make use of by the Communist Party and serve the interest of the Communist Party of China. So that chair leads the whole council, and the council has some vice chair and executive members who are minister or vice minister or director of the departments of various ministries across the Chinese government, including education, foreign affairs, finance, propaganda department. We have propaganda department in China, and information, everything you can imagine. So it's the whole government is leading this Hanban. And I give you just one example. I just heard last night when my film screened at Lund University, and one audience's members taught Chinese. He himself is a Swedish. Taught Chinese language at Confucius Institutes in Stockholm University. He told me the Chinese instructors said something which is different than the Chinese government. And that Chinese instructor teaching at the Confucius Institutes was actually disciplined by Hanban or by Chinese government, which is if you say something or think the way different than the Chinese government, you will get yourself in trouble, including the Chinese instructor teaching at the Confucius Institute. So I would only say you are lucky, you experienced a good thing. And those instructors, they know, they were trained before they were sent to foreign universities. They represent Chinese government in foreign countries. They know how to behave and speak. If not, themselves will be in trouble.
In the documentary, the girl said she left 3 days after signing the contract without getting any training. So that's kind of self-contradictory.
No, she got training. In the film, she said she got training, and that's exactly what happened.
And I'm sorry, we could unfold this to an extent of several more hours, I'm sure, but we are desperately running out of time, already 7 minutes beyond time. I think if it's okay with you, I'll just allow each of you to have a very short closing comment, starting with you, Thomas, if you have something.
I'm afraid I have to leave.
That's okay, Miguel. That's okay. Thank you so much for coming, Miguel.
Well, I'm just happy to be a part of the debate. It's true, the last question, that of course it's up to the media also to have a fine balance and not exaggerate any controversy or not bring anything out that is not proven. So of course there's a fine balance also by saying that not all Confucius Institutes are necessarily bad and influenced. There might also be some that are absolutely fine and following the Danish legislation. So I also think that, especially to the media, a responsibility that we have to take care of.
Spoken like a true journalist. Kenneth?
I think I would like to see the good ones. In all due respect, Thomas, I'm not so much about being naive. I think I would like to have a little closing comment to the question which was posed before. Some years ago, I was invited to speak at the Danish Institute of the Study Abroad. At that meeting, there were a lot of Chinese exchange students. The meeting had to do with Danish politics. But for some reason or matter, we delved into Chinese politics too. And unfortunately, I came to criticize the Chinese government quite forcefully, I think, mentioning the Lao guy and so on. This made several of these girls who were there from China break down in tears. And they told me that I was not supposed to be talking in that way about China, because they love China, and what I've just said wasn't a thing going on in China. Today, I think that they were kind of brainwashed, to say the least. I think it was a good idea for them to come to Denmark. But unfortunately, I don't think I made that much of an impression. They were still living in neglect. And I think that is unfortunate. But it says a lot about the people of China, that they do not know, or they do not want to acknowledge what is happening in their country. They are, for some peoples, for some of them, they are indeed brainwashed. I have not been invited to speak at the Danish Institute for the Study Abroad since. So I don't know if it was because I was too open-minded, but I have not had the good fortune of going there since. I hope there'll be a new chance, and I also hope there'll be Chinese students present. Thank you for coming.
All right, and Christian, lastly?
I would have preferred to get a chance to answer some of the questions, but I'm not very agreed with Kenneth's answers. That's why I try to protest a little bit. And I hoped we could discuss a little bit more about what is the answer from the Danish state, from Danish politicians, from Danish press to these questions. Of course there are big troubles. Of course soft power is dangerous also for Denmark. But I think we have some good things in the Danish society to answer these attacks. And I don't feel that we are very weak in these fights, even that China is very big, because our ideas and our critical traditions, our democracy will win in these questions. Look at one thing. Kenneth had wrote his book, and in his world, critical thinking, in my mind, is left-wing thinking. And that's not true. That's the finest way of using our intellectual power and using our universities. That is to be critical, to raise questions to everything and to everybody, even our friends. If we don't do that, then we also will end in hell, like some other countries. And I would prefer that we try to use our power to find where are our strengths, how can we develop these strengths, how can we give the right answer, and also, I think really we can interfere in Chinese thinking, in Chinese tradition. And I think that we don't have to be afraid of also going into cooperation. But I would like to discuss with the now ruling power in Denmark, why do we stop Greenland? Why can they not themselves decide who they want to work together with? Why should the big power in Denmark decide that? At the same time that the Danish government accept a hell of a lot of invest money going into the Danish society. A lot of companies, a lot of things is bought of Chinese money in these years. That's okay. That's Denmark. But Greenland, they don't have the right to self decide what's happening. I think we have a double moral in institutions.
Yeah, all right. So, as we can see, it's a debate that goes on many levels. There are many ways of viewing this, and there are many sensitivities around this also. But I would just like to say that I hope that the Danish universities and schools can keep up that critical thinking, even when it has to do with the issue of money also. And on that note, I would just very much like to thank Doris for coming here, and to Thomas for providing us insight, for Kenneth for the debate and for arranging this and allowing a platform, and for Kristen for your comments and for participating. Yeah, of course.
I just think it's important also to provide some options of Chinese language and cultural learning, as the last question mentioned. If we rejected Confucius Institutes, have you rejected that chance? Yes, that's one option, but the cost, think of if you take that opportunity, what are the costs, risks, and threats? Is it worth? But that's only one option. There are Chinese language teaching in Taiwan, but it's the only democracy among all the Chinese population, and Taiwan preserves traditional Chinese culture much more better than the mainland does. Mainland experienced the 10-year-long cultural revolution when the traditional Chinese cultures, all, if not all, but mostly destroyed by the ruling Communist Party. Remember that. So if you want to have authentic Chinese culture and language learning, I think probably currently Taiwan would be a better option than the mainland China. And I think also talking about Denmark, I would really encourage your Danish politicians, as you said, take strong stands in front of the Chinese Communist Party ruling, and you need perhaps some new legal tool, which will empower Danish governments to counter this Chinese Communist Party's political influence. I'm not sure if maybe you don't like America, but in this particular case, after the American passed a new law last August, there have been 5 universities announced the closure of the Confucius Institutes. Very effective. I think legal tool is must. So I know Danish people are smart, diligent, very intelligent, and love your value. You have to safeguard your country, your value. Do not allow a dictatorship to invade you without knowing, in a subtle way. Thank you for coming.
After the premiere, evidence showing that censorship from the Confucius Institutes in Denmark has occurred eventually aroused the interest and concern of the media.